All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Levy. I'm going to be the Prime Minister, and I will start my time in three, two, one. Whereas an integration policy is the best and only way for governments to maintain control over the carceral system, we are so proud to propose. The order of this speech is going to be top of case, and then I will talk about our one contention. So, first of all, on some definitions and top of case. We'd like to define this house as a rational actor, and we think this round should be judged on um, net benefit to like the Latin American countries, which is ultimately what the governments want and are looking for. Okay, other definitions that are important. First of all, a gang is just like an organized group of criminals. This includes like extortion rings, drug cartels, et cetera, et cetera. And like characterization wise. We tell that governments in Latin American nations that have a significant amount of gang violence and organized crime are inevitably going to be corrupt, at least at the local level. Why is this? Well, first of all, we tell that the gangs are very powerful and heavily armed. They have a significant amount of firepower and can use this to threaten local government like officials or threaten candidates in elections, which lets them like influence like have influence over the government. And secondly, there's like huge amounts of money from like the drug trade or other illegal operations. And this means that like government salaries for low level officials, like running prisons, for example, just can't compete with the amount of money that like is being offered. As a result, like law enforcement or like carceral officers are often bribed into like compliance with gangs or at least to turn a blind eye to their activities. Um, Yeah, and so like it's in the info slide, like there's rising gang violence and prison overcrowding. Governments do not have total control over the prisons the way like we think they do in like the United States or like a Western nation. And I think that's really important to like keep in mind throughout this whole like debate. Okay,
POI.
yeah,
Do you believe that the lives and quality of life of the prisoners matter?
absolutely it matters, and I'll get into like why there's going to be violence in both cases, for example. But I think it's important to note that like lives of prisoners do matter, but like violence and crime affects the entire nation. And so just like the amount of people affected by like the ability of these gangs to continue operating, um, we should consider like the civilians first, especially yeah, particularly we should focus on civilians. Okay, so our first contention is on like maintaining control over prisons. We tell that like if you have like a segregation policy, it means a singular gang is going to like populate each prison. We tell you that this gang will have total control over like the entire prison and all the prisoners, because they're gang members, they're all loyal, and like there's no time spent like competing for power with other gangs or like jockeying for influence. Gangs are not going to check each other's influence in the opposition's world. There also won't be any other like unaffiliated prisoners in the way. And ultimately, it's going to be more difficult for government and prison staff to control like these prisons. Again, the gangs are going to be a large united group. They can probably smuggle in contraband or weapons, or just like make them on their own in the prison, which can let them overpower threatened guards. They can bring in money to like bribe the staff. And like again, you can look at our characterization of why like governments in these nations are too weak to prevent this from like happening in some level. And so like an integrated system is superior because we see like gangs spending time and resources jockeying for power, and like they're go easier to be controlled because they're essentially it's a policy of like divide and conquer. The gangs are going to be competing with each other, and so they cannot take control of the prison. Because we tell that in the opposition's world, in a segregated
POI.
system, sure.
Would this increase in competition not lead to more violence over time?
Um, it doesn't lead to more violence because we tell you a significant amount of violence that occurs in gangs is like intra-gang. It's within one group because you see people jockeying for power within the hierarchy. You see higher ups like conducting violent initiations or like reprisals on people who are not you know, like following their orders, or you see like gang members like conducting operations that like lead to like violence outside on civilians. For example, if you have like leaders who are set up like safe in these prisons, they can like order killings or hits on people who are outside of the prison with basically impunity because they're already in prison. They're already supposed to be incapacitated, unable to do that. And so the government has like no further options because you already put them in prison and they're continuing to kill people. And so what else can you do? That's the greatest weakness on side opposition's case. And so as the gangs are running operations out of the prison, they can continue to trade drugs, like do other like nefarious acts, right? Like I talked about like including like intra-gang violence in prison, violence within gangs, um, like gang members and leaders directing like operations outside of prison, like I mentioned. Like law enforcement and like government officials in the prisons are going to be like more corrupt and there's more money. There's this like expectation of like um gangs are giving payouts like prison leaders, so like there's an expectation of bribes, so people will go into it thinking they can make money. So corruption grows worse in ops world. And it's also easier for prisoners to escape because again, you have this big organized group of people who like if they wanted to could easily like overpower, just bribe the guards and leave. Everyone on the inside is going to be helping each other. Um, and that's if they even want to escape and that they're not like happy using the prison as an essentially like base of operations. But it's going to lead to like more criminals on the street, more criminals in general, more crime, increased violence, like drug trading, human trafficking. And so the impacts here is that an integrated system maintains deterrence because prisons do not become like effectively operating bases for gangs. Criminals will like have like it like going to prison will actually be a deterrent since you're no longer around like your fellow gang members. And people will feel like less emboldened to join gangs if there's integrated prisons. We also decrease crime because again, integration makes it more difficult for gangs to commit crimes inside and outside of prison. And we like decrease corruption. There are like fewer like instances of like a gang being able to unite and take control over a prison, which is looks very, very bad for the government. It looks weak. It looks like it's being run by gangs, which is going to lead to people stop trusting the government, which is going to weaken support for law enforcement and like, which is bad in general. It's going to ruin the legitimacy of the government that is ultimately trying to help the people. And for all these reasons, we are so proud to propose.
Thank you to the Gov for the speech. Just a quick introduction. My name is Nikhil. I'm going to be the first and third for the negation side. Before I begin, I just want to preface, I am a little bit sick right now, so if I cough, just apologize for that. And yeah. All right, so order's just going to be neg case, half case. Time starts on my next word. This House believes governments in Latin America should pursue an integration over segregation policy in prisons for gangs. In this round, Judge, prioritize short-term loss of life and prison stability. Loss of life. Governments have a duty to care for incarcerated individuals since these prisoners cannot remove the danger themselves. The state controls the environment, which means that deaths in custody are directly harms from the state. What that means is that the state is responsible for these lives, so prioritize short-term loss of life. Stability, rehab, and integration programs, they require safe schedules, safe movement of staff access, and also classroom environments. Riots and gang conflicts, they make lockdowns, program cancellations, and make emergency containment protocols. Prisons, they would have to deal with these kinds of things, and, without rehab programs, the prisoners won't be able to manage the real world. In this round, we are debating the short-term laws. But first of all, let's just look at why the framers chose this resolution to be the way it is. The res is made to debate whether it would be better for short-term impacts during the certain time of them being in prison. So again, the resolution is made so that we can debate which prison method is better to help the prisoners in the short term because they have control of their lives in that time, not whole governmental policies like La Mano Dura, which would help shut down gangs. So the end goal here, the reason that we're debating this round in the way that it's made is so that we can debate what's going to be better for the quality of life for the prisoners themselves. The weighing mechanism should be net benefits for prisoners. Again, cross-apply the warrants from the impacts of loss of life, and they don't have the ability to get away from the danger, so it's the state's responsibility to make sure that they stay safe. Our first contention, large-scale prison violence. Rival gangs in Latin America often have long histories of lethal force and retaliation. A strict honor and territory is part of that culture, and it's incentivized to attack enemies that are vulnerable. What's more vulnerable than prison? Violence is inevitable. If a member of a gang fails to attack a rival member when vulnerable, consequences would be included. You can lose your status, punishment from higher-ups, reduced protection. Violence between gangs is not optional. It is a survival strategy for individuals trapped within these gang systems. Prison conditions magnify in incentives for violence. Prisons often have extreme overcrowding, especially in Latin American countries. This means that they have less guards per person, slower response times, and less supervision in general. These conditions remove the safe zones that may exist in a prison, which would lead to constant exposure. Also, corruption within Latin America spreads well to the criminal system, meaning that guards could be bought off or bribed to create more violence. The integration probably also strengthened gangs' cohesion even more by creating a big shared threat across multiple different prisons. Especially when violence does happen, gangs will use that as justification to fight more and more. Segregation solves. Separating rival gangs does three things. It removes constant proximity, it reduces the available triggers for violence, and it allows authorities to predict and manage possible risks that may come. Conflicts may still exist, but they are so much more containable and probably less, which is obviously the key to safety. It also leads stability in the system. It prevents avoidable death, which is the best net benefit for the prisoners in these gangs. Condition number 2, not the root cause. Changing how gangs are housed in prison can reduce prison violence inside of the prison itself, but it probably won't affect gang violence themselves. Gang persistence in Latin America is produced by chronic poverty, territorial control, and cultural exclusion. Because these forces exist outside of the prison and will continue to happen after the release, prison integration doesn't have long-term solvency for rehabilitation. Instead, segregation at least has the chance to make sure that these people are going to be safe after policies are implemented, because there are simply more people alive and safe within the op world. Also, wouldn't being with your enemies allow you to give more information to your people on the outside? That leads to more violence. Contention number 3, rehabilitation program. Rehab programs require psychological safety without any form of mistrust. Integrated prisons, they have inmates that stay gang members. You won't be able to rehabilitate yourself. There are constant threats. Basically, just seeing a member vulnerable, attack. Participation is seen as a weakness rather than focusing on getting better, seeing how you can fit back into society. They are just basically trying to kill each other. Fear of retaliation for cooperation. Inmates are hurt by these norms, making it more difficult for them to adjust to reality. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, you have segregated prisons. They have lower inter-gang threats, more stable environments, and a willingness to learn with your peers, especially if your peers are people that you know. At the end of the day, rehab programs only work in segregated prisons where the rehabilitation stays the focus. All right, moving into responses. So my opponents, they start with their, this house is a rational actor. We agree with that. Net benefits for Latin American countries. We tell you that it should be net benefits for the prisoners themselves, because in this case specifically, who controls their proximity to danger? Who controls their availability to danger? It is going to be the prisons themselves. That is the state. The state controls. And if the state controls, we have to care about the prisoners' lives, and more governmental, larger policies are probably going to solve in the long run, like La Mano Dura, which is not what we are debating today. So prioritize short-term laws and also prioritize the lives of the prisoners, because they're the ones in control by the state. They also go on this long tangent of analysis about how law enforcement can be bribed into compliance with gangs. First of all, even if some prisons or law enforcement officials are bribed by gangs, that actually makes integration more risky, not safer, because putting rival gangs together creates more chances for corruption to lead to violence. If different hostile gangs are in the same prison, one corrupt guard, they can let weapons, pass messages, or give special access to one group's attack, which quickly turns into fights or riots. That means that the danger from corruption, it spreads across multiple gangs instead of staying contained. Keeping gangs separated limits how much harm one bribed official causes. And because there are fewer cross-gang conflicts, they can influence. With that, we're basically clearly able to see here that this is a non-unique issue. Corruption is just non-unique. It should be solved by direct anti-corruption tools rather than prison mixing policy. Bribery, it happens under any incarceration model, and the effective fixes are things like guard rotation, higher pay, external oversight, surveillance, or independent audits, none of which are requiring integrating gangs. All of these are independent solutions to this issue. Okay. Continuing down the flow. They say that violence and crime affect the whole. Also, when gang members are spread out across many prisons in the country, this creates many more fronts for violence. All right. And then they say that violence and crime affects the entire nation. Again, we tell you that while that might be true, the people in prison are not the root cause for this to happen. It's the violence that happens outside of the prison. So we need to contain what's happening inside the prison, make them rehab, go back into society, more control. Their only contention is about maintaining control over the prisoners. They say that gangs will have total control over the prisoners or the prison prisoners. Non-unique point in this round. They say that gang members are all loyal. Gang power comes from outside of the prison. They say that they have a large united group. Integration, it strengthens gangs through a network. And they say that the country is too weak to prevent this from happening. And again, we tell you that segregation, it preserves the minimum stability for any real weakening of the gangs. Next, they basically start an analysis about how significant amount of gang violence, or how there's a significant amount of violence in gangs is intergang. It happens within the gang. Well, that's actually a double bind, Judge. They're in a double bind there. If it's intergang, how are they united enough to be doing bad things in the prison, cause crime within the prison itself? That's a double bind. Either they are connected and they're going to learn together, or either they have interconflict and they're not going to cause bad things to happen, or they don't have interconflict and they're going to be able to properly rehab themselves and work better together. They say that they continue to trade drugs for nefarious acts. But again, gang members outside of the prisons do these things. The people inside the prison obviously don't have access to those resources. They say that prison is a deterrence, but clearly it's been a deterrence because it's not a deterrence because gang activity happens outside and it still continues to happen. So again, the purpose of this round is not to debate whether or how to deconstruct gangs. Rather, how should we manage these prisoners, prioritize their safety, make sure that they are safe, and make sure that their lives are getting better, that they're rehabilitized, and make sure that they integrate back into society better. And more governmental overreaching policies can be passed, like La Mano Dura, in order to make sure that you break up gangs. With that, I strongly urge a neck ballot. Thank you.
Okay, is everyone ready? Okay, my name is Eden, and I'm going to start my time in 3, 2, 1. Okay, I'll be the second speaker for the Gov side of case. I'm first going to go into some like top of case stuff, and then I'm going to be going into the opposition's case before finally going back up into the Gov case. So we believe that the opposition mischaracterizes prisons as being a separate world in like Latin American countries, but this simply isn't true. Both sides gave extensive analysis about why there is like corruption in the carceral system, but what side opposition misses is the fact that this corruption enables gangs to operate in the same prison or the same in prisons as they do like outside of as they do like without. They can smuggle resources in, they can send orders out. They're saying that like when you're in prison, these gangs like aren't actually doing any nefarious acts. This is just simply not true. There are extensive like drug trafficking, like drug like operations inside prisons, even in like Western countries. Um, they also talk about like how like we should talk about or like sorry, that like the government has like control over like the prisoners, so like they're the ones we should focus on, but like the governments have to have control over the prisons, like, and we think we should focus on both like the net benefits for the prisoners but also the net benefits for the like civilians, because the government is not only responsible for the people that it puts in prison, it's responsible for all of its citizens. It has to protect civilians and prisoners in the short term. There are more civilians in a country than prisoners, and we think that it's fundamentally like a misunderstanding to only focus this or like on the prisoners, because there's more civilians at risk of being in danger than civilian or than prisoners, because there's simply more civilians, and government is also responsible for them, and they're more responsible since civilians are often the innocent victims of crimes. Also, the warrant that only the state is responsible for prisoners' safety is simply like not true. When gangs are basically running these prisons, and their actions inside the prisons are affecting the civilians outside. Um, okay. They talk about how like keeping gangs separated limits the harms that like one gang can cause, but we warned it out in our case on how like actually having a singular gang inside, like as the only gang inside the prison, leads to like a lack of like checks and balances and like infighting that causes there to be more opportunity for a gang to make or take control over the prison and be able to continue and even do like more of these like drug trafficking and other operations inside a prison. They also talked about like how we should focus on like containing the prisoners and like rehabbing the prisoners. But we think that this is like not it's not true that there will be rehab programs in either world. These Latin American governments already like in the motion stated that there's like prison overcrowding and like and so we don't believe that the government has enough resources to prevent overcrowding or to stop violence. We don't So the government already doesn't have enough resources to prevent overcrowding or to stop violence. Like what makes you think they have enough money for like job training or actual rehab programs? We believe that they don't. Furthermore, we don't believe that even if they have these programs, that gang members on any side will participate in them because of pressure from like higher like up gang members. Also, prisons are porous due to like corruption, especially due to like segregation, which allows prisoners to like take over and organize prisoners. So that's why we believe integration is the best method to contain these prisoners. And okay, I'm going to move into the op case now. On their top of case stuff, they talk about how we should prioritize the short-term loss of life in like of the prisoners and like prison stability, but we believe we should actually prioritize the life of civilians, like I mentioned, because there are more civilians and they are greatly affected by the gang violence and also like the sex and drug trade that are like perpetrated by gang members. Also, the civilians are innocent and they have not committed any crimes. And the government needs to protect the innocent civilians, of course, along with the prisoners, but we should not just focus on the prisoners. This is like the whole point of yeah. Okay. So, they talk about how like it's like the government has to like have control to like deal with like the um sorry. Okay. Okay, I'm gonna move on to the opposition's first contention on prison violence. They talk about like their prisons with like integration. There's gonna be like a lot of fighting between gangs, and they're going to like attack their vulnerable rivals. We talked about how they prison or like gangs also attack their own people, and ultimately like we believe that like violence is like the unifying force within a gang, and it's like the main mechanism for why like a gang stays together because members fear leaving it like because they fear violence and like violence against their family members, so they're going to stay in line. So we believe that there's a lot of violence like there is a lot of violence in gangs, and so their point about like violence between gangs is non-unique um to integrated systems. Um, they talk about like how there's like a lack of safe zones in prisons, which we also think that there can be, which are like cells. There's often like fighting goes on in like public areas, which is like what goes on like I mean outside of prisons, like any fighting will be in a public area and like the safe zones inside prisons would be like civilian cells. Okay, they also talk about how like corruption is going to like spread into the criminal system because like guards can like still be bought out. But we believe that corruption actually increases with segregation because it's easier for one like united prison population to take over prison, and the impact of corruption is going to be greater because gangs can continue to commit crimes outside the prison and direct violence in the broader world. Um, they also talked about like segregation, like or um yeah, okay. Now on their second contention, they talk about how like this is not the root cause of like of gang violence, like it's not prisons, and so like prison integration doesn't have long-term solvency. But we believe that like although like it's not long-term solvency, we're keeping both the civilians and the gang members safer in the short term because we are not allowing prisoners to take control over the prisons, which will allow them to increase crime and violence affecting civilians outside the prison and the gang members themselves. And on their third contention on rehab, we warranted out in like top of case stuff again how there will not be rehab programs in these countries. So this is not relevant. And like we said, even if there is rehab programs, even if you buy that there would be rehab programs in these countries, in these prisons, we again don't believe that it will work because in a gang, everyone stays in line and won't do it because gang leaders from the inside or outside prisons will pressure members to continue committing crimes and not go to rehab. And also gang members will fear going to rehab or doing anything against the gang because again, gang in violence within gangs is such a big issue and like gangs perpetrate a lot of their own violence. To our first contention on maintaining control of prisons, they talk about how like if they can't be like united enough to like work together if there's also violence, but like we talked about before, like we believe that violence is the unifying force in gangs, and like gangs stay together because they fear violence, and when people um like don't comply with the gang, they will also experience violence. So we believe that violence is happening on either side of the house. They often talk about how like people in prisons don't have access to like the drug trade, but like we said before, there's so much drug activity inside prisons and it increases because it's easier with segregated prisons. Thank you. I urge a government ballot.
Great speech. I have 8 minutes. Quick off time roadmap. I'm gonna go top of case. I'm gonna go kind of characterization of the round. Then I'll probably go top down. I'll extend a lot of the opposition case, and then I'll go counter responses onto onto the AF case, and then extending any refutes that one dropped. So is anybody not ready? All right, great. You can start my time now. Judge, the affirmation loses this round insofar as they concede that these prisoners themselves are not the root cause of violence. They tell you and they try to characterize it as, oh, well, they have a mechanism or a better way at creating more violence. But once again, they drop the fact that they are not the root cause. Within our first contention, we give you the warranting that the culture around gangs, as well as the crippling economy within a lot of these Latin American countries, is the root cause of violence. And we tell you that corruption on both sides outside of the prison system is completely non-unique. But even if you don't buy that, let's go on to the net benefits like kind of debate here. We tell you that we should be prioritizing number one, like the individuals and lives of the gang members that are in prison, because when you can keep them safe and keep them stable and have them have like at least a better mental health than they would before, that's the only option or only world in which rehabilitation is effective in the first place. They completely mischaracterize our argument. Our argument is not that we are going to rehabilitate them now. The argument is that if rehabilitation occurs, it's completely useless within the affirmation world simply because their mental state is not as well as the opposition, as well as the fact that they're going to be way more violence. We read you this warrant within the third contention. We tell you that rehab programs require psychological safety without mistrust, and within integrated prisons, we tell you
POI.
inmates always stay as gang POC or POI.
I. POI.
Yeah, what's up?
Do you think if you're scared of your like gang leader, do you feel safe?
Probably not. All right, continue though. On a response to that point, they tell you that a lot of reasons why people stay in gangs is because of fear, but that point is once again non-unique, and there's another two responses here. Okay, the first response, again, it's non-unique because there's fear in both worlds, and there's probably more fear within the affirmation world, because if you don't attack a weak enemy that's seen as an enemy of the gang, your leader is probably going to be more mad at you as opposed to like just existing with your gang members within a prison. But they also don't read to you a specific or like unique enough reason as to why like living with your gang members will make you be more scared of your leader. They don't give you that warranting, and we tell you that when you live with opposite or like enemies from other gangs and you don't have violence, then you're probably going to be in more trouble. And this is why we tell you that in the warrant, violence is inevitable within this integration, and this completely goes conceded within the LOC. We tell you in the first negation speech that violence is inevitable within integrated systems of like prisoners because it's a survival strategy for these individuals trapped within these gang systems. They do fear violence. They fear violence from their gang leader if they don't attack. And we tell you that violence or that fear is probably more when you're with like enemies or like opposing gangs as opposed to like when you're with your own gang. And they don't draw you any warrantation as to how that's uniquely different, and they didn't do that within the PMC or the MGs, so you can't buy any responses on that later. All right, let's go top down on the affirmation so far. On their first contention about maintaining control over prisons, there's a couple big responses that they dropped. First, they drop our double bind, where they say if there's intergang violence, so they tell you that there's going to be intergang violence, but then how is intergang violence going to lead to like a very big united prison that can have corruption outside? But also, even if there is intergang violence, we argue that there's going to be less intergang violence than out of gang violence because simply like they're a gang, they're part of a culture, they grew up in the same area, they have like these same beliefs and same morals, and they've been fighting together for a while, meaning like I don't buy that like there's going to be more intergang violence. But again, they don't respond to this double bind, so you can literally vote opposition there. But also, they tell you that there can be safe zones within these integrated areas. We tell you there's two big reasons. They literally say that prison guards are corrupt, so you can turn this point. And it's easier to fight against individuals within a prison when one prison guard is corrupt, as opposed to fighting individuals outside of the prison when you're like all connected. What I mean is that violence within like an integrated sector or integrated prison system is much more plausible and inevitable simply because if one person bribes a guard or one person pays off a guard or smuggles a gun or smuggles a weapon, they are able to attack any of these individuals without being in trouble or without like really getting into too much trouble. And the thing is that we tell you that when you have multiple or integrated gang members, a key turn here is that you're going to have these gang members spread out across more prisons in the country, meaning that violence in every single prison, once again, is inevitable, as we tell you, which goes dropped, but we also tell you it's probably more widespread because the violence is happening in almost every single prison as opposed to one. And we tell you that even if they assume that like this one really big hypothetical prison is just going to have a takeover, no thank you. But if they assume that like a prison is just going to be taken over by this gang, we tell you that it's probably better than having like multiple like fronts of war within every single prison in these countries, meaning that there's probably more violence within the affirmation world. And we also tell you that like the problem of like gangs working outside or communicating with people outside is not really a matter of like the gang people in prison, but more of a matter of security and like prison security in general. And we tell you that this is probably non-unique because there's going to be a lot of people who are reaching out to their individual or other gang members within your integrated, no thank you, I'll take all of them at the end if I have time. There's going to be more individuals within your integrated system that are reaching out to their bosses, and then they're going to have and incite violence within the prison system because that's simply what their bosses want, meaning that there's no solvency for the violence that happens within these prisons. Second, they completely drop the argument on how they are not the root cause. We tell you that gang persistence in Latin America is primarily produced by chronic poverty, territorial control, and cultural exclusion. And we tell you that the policies to implement and fix that aren't debated within this round. We give you an example like El Mano Duro, which is like an El Salvadorian policy to try and help and stop corruption within El Salvador. But even if you don't buy that example, just buy the fact that to create economic change or create big cultural change to stop poverty and stop gang violence, you need a big policy or a big governmental policy, meaning that there's no solvency for the root cause of corruption or root cause of gang violence within the affirmation world. All we are allowing within the opposition world is less inter-prison violence, which is what we tell you we should be focusing on, but we also lead to less out-of-prison violence in their own wing mechanism, because in general, there's going to be less violence across less fronts of prisons. There's going to be less prisons that are violent, there's going to be less communication outside onto specific prisons, which means that there's going to be less violence in general leaking out. Next, they concede our argument about rehab programs. Their only response is that, oh, we don't think they're going to join because of the pressure, but we tell you that with aid in governmental policies, these rehab programs will like effectively work. We tell you that with aid in governmental policies, affirmation rehab programs won't work, so that's a unique benefit to the opposition that you can vote on right there. As well as that, on their first contention, they drop a lot of our responses. They drop all of the cross applications of our case onto their responses or onto their contention, which is like number one, that like, once again, it's not the root cause of violence. Again, that violence is inevitable specifically within integrated systems, and they don't give you this warranting that violence is inevitable within segregated systems. They say that it might happen or that they might have an entire government takeover. But we tell you that it's probably easier to have security for a segregated group because like there's like one guard probably won't be corrupted or one guard probably won't be bribed into turning on their own intergang violence, meaning that if everybody in the prison is the same like gang or from the same gang, they're not going to bribe guards in order to fight each other. They're not going to bribe guards in order to have prison violence compared as opposed to the affirmation world, meaning that you're probably going to lead to less corruption in general because like the prison system and the prison security system is able to be more organized and controlling over a specific group of people because they all share the same ideals, and there's less people that are going to try and incite violence within the prison itself because they're all from the same gang to begin with. So for all of those reasons, under both weighing mechanisms, I urge a strong vote for the opposition side of the debate.
Alrighty. I've got 4 minutes. Quick off time. I'm gonna start with my collapse. And then I'll move on to some more analysis on the top of case and the weighing and the rehab programs. Time starts at my next word. Judge, you cleanly vote neg on large-scale gang violence. This round should be decided on short-term loss of life and prison stability, and on that metric segregation, it clearly wins. Rival gangs in Latin America have deep histories of retaliation and honor-based violence, where attacking the enemy is often required to maintain your status and protection. So when you force them in the same space, violence isn't a possibility, it's predictable, it's going to happen. Overcrowded prisons have already got fewer guards, slower response times, which means that conflicts escalate before staff can intervene, leading to mass riots and casualties. Integration, it multiplies each and every single day the amount of violence that happens between the gangs and their rivals. That creates constant triggers, while segregation removes the proximity. It lowers the number of these flashpoints of where the violence can spread from. That makes threats easier for officials to predict and manage. Even if violence doesn't disappear, it becomes contained instead of a system-wide problem. And we prevent avoidable death, which is the biggest net benefit in this round for the prisoners who cannot escape the danger themselves. Now, on the rehab programs itself, I know my opponent spent a good chunk of time talking about how these rehab programs won't happen. First, we tell you that this intergang violence, it comes first. It is basically like it's the first blockade for these rehab programs. Even if they are able to get resources, which they will be able to when you deal with less gang violence by having these segregated gangs rather than integrated gangs, segregated prisons rather than integrated prisons. These rehabilitation programs are going to just fully be stopped if you have integrated gangs. You're not even giving them, or integrated prisons, sorry. You're not even giving them the opportunity to rehabilitate. Because again, we tell you that not showing up to things like, places where they'll teach you vocational training, give you some education, though that's seen as weak. Or you're given orders by your prisoner who is out, or by a gang leader who is outside of the prison telling you, hey, go kill that guy. Why? Because you guys are not together. You guys have a network across several prisons. And that's what goes absolutely conceded. Once my opponents concede that this is not the root cause, that the prisons are not the root cause, that these gangs themselves have other issues as to why they fight for what they fight, that's where it starts from, Judge. And if we understand and we acknowledge that this is not the root cause, then you cleanly vote neg. Violence across multiple prisons justifies even more violence outside of prisons, and that increases tensions. People go, hey, you killed my guy in prison, I'm gonna kill you now, right? People see that as extra violence and more reason to pull out their guns and more reason to start fighting. On the top of case analysis, my opponents say that opposition mischaracterizes prisons as a separate world, but we tell you that the orders are not from the prisoners inside, but the gang members outside. And if, again, it is still connected. They say on the frame of net benefits. Again, we tell you that other than just doing for net benefits or for the prisoners and civilians, it's imperative in this round, especially with how the framers have focused on it, that it might be the state's responsibility to the citizens, but the way that the framers put this round together, we are looking at what method is better for the prisoners. Again, if they wanted us to be debating something on the frame of how are we going to deconstruct gangs and help civilians live better lives, the method of doing that would be through La Mano Dura, right? Which is some kind of large policy shift that would be able to actually decide, hey, let's deconstruct gangs. Rather, in this round, we are debating what method is better for the prisoners themselves, right? How are we going to help the prisoners rehabilitate? How are we going to help them get back into society? Which method is best for the prisoner safety and overall to decrease the amount of inter-prison violence and make sure that you're improving the quality of lives for those people. All right. Security for segregated prisons is easier because it's all under one unified group with these same intentions, meaning you can control them much easier. This turns the entire case as it decreases violence outside of the round when you decrease violence inside of the prisons. You stop the prisons, you decrease the amount of violence outside. With that, I strongly urge a neg ballot. Thank you, Judge.
All right, everybody, I'm still Levy. I am going to, or the speech is going to be like top of case framework debate and then talking about why side government wins. With that, I will start my time in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so real quickly on this point of framework, side opposition consistently mischaracterizes both the nature of prisons and the responsibility that a government has. So, first of all, on the nature of prisons, side opposition argues that because the government is solely like in control of the fate of prisoners, then that's what we should prioritize, essentially. That's their key warrant. Well, this warrant falls when in both worlds the government is not in sole control of like these prisons, where gangs have significant influence over the lives of prisoners. In Ops world, where gangs have basically are implicitly ceded control over the lives of prisoners. it just doesn't make sense for like the government to like talk about, oh, the only goal we have is to protect these criminals. In fact, the main goal of the government is to protect civilians and to protect like everybody who's living in a state. And sure, we agree. Like this kind of policy is not going to solve the root cause. That doesn't matter. We don't need to like debate the root cause of something to try to find a way to mitigate its harms as much as possible. We tell you that right now, like like violence that like from gangs that is uniquely enabled by them operating with impunity in prisons kills thousands of people, it like traffics huge amounts of drugs, like ruins lives for like civilians like in these countries and honestly all over the world. Um, and so because like minimizing these harms is so uniquely important and affects so many people, we think this is what you should focus around on. It just doesn't make sense. Oh, we should only focus on the prisons where this kind of carceral policy affects the whole nation, because the criminals affect the whole nation. So like this just isn't like a logical framework for them. Um, okay. Um, Yeah, and then the other thing is like I really want to like emphasize the fact that like corruption, which both sides agree is rampant in like the carceral system in Latin America, leads to porous prisons, right? Like this means sure gang leaders from outside the prison can like issue orders. We agree that can happen in both sides. But what side opposition misses is the fact that gang members can operate within these prisons and issue orders to the outside, and how this gives them pretty much complete immunity. Like we read this in our case where like if you're already in prison, you're already a gang leader. Like, there's nothing more the government can do to stop you. You're already in prison. You're already supposed to be incapacitated. You're already supposed to be being punished, right? But you're simply not because your gang in a segregated system has taken over the entire prison, and the guards have basically conceded to like letting you take over the entire prison, and so you can issue orders to the outside, right? Like, there's no like managing these conflicts by having one gang like have influence over a prison. It's just it's an abdication of control simply because of the corruption that both sides agree. And insofar as this abdication of control, two gang leaders who are within prisons and can operate with impunity and issue orders to the outside and cannot be punished further, and how this argument goes pretty much dropped, this is a clean vote for the government. Like it's completely clean because these people are leading to thousands of deaths like I mentioned. They're continuing to trade drugs. The drug trade is like leading people to get addicted and ruin their lives. Obviously, that's a net benefit harm. It's leading to more violence. They're ordering hits on rivals outside of prison. Like that's a very clear net benefit harm. People are dying. There's more violence. There's more retribution. Okay. And the other thing that's going to happen is people are going to see law enforcement giving power to violent gangs in these prisons, like for all the reasons we mentioned, corruption, putting all the gang members in one place so they can work together. People are going to see gangs have control over these prisons, which is going to be just like a huge like net like perception impact where people are going to stop trusting the government, right? Like this, like we don't get
Yo,
a
pause
government.
time.
Yeah,
The analysis of the public perception about gangs and like seceding that power to the.
was in my first speech.
I don't have that on my flow, but judge's discretion.
Yeah, I'm gonna say it's in like I have it as an impact on my like first contention. I remember reading it.
All right, judge's discretion.
Yeah, so 3:52, I'm gonna resume time. Okay. All right. And so like we tell that there's just like a clean government win on like prevent minimizing like violence from inside the prison to the outside. So let's talk about ops possible paths to the ballot. The first one is on rehabilitation. But we tell you that this simply they never access, right? Like side opposition concedes that like you will fear your gang leader. Like there's probably like because of all the mechanisms they like said of like why like gangs like exist because of the violence unifying them. There's going to be peer pressure. People aren't going to like try to rehabilitate. When gangs control a prison, that like as we warranted, that prison is just going to become a hub for like drug trafficking. So there's just like no way you access rehabilitation in either world because even if we get some other like big rehab reform policy, like it doesn't matter because even if there's no violence in these prisons, they're just drug trading hubs. And so you can't have rehab in like a violent like war like gang war prison. You can't have rehab in in like basically like a gang safe house either. So you can't access that. Okay. And then the other point is like on like violence within these prisons. First of all, just like look at like our like I think we've won the framework debate. Like harms to civilians simply outweighs like because of like just on the amount of like civilians being harmed, the way that they're being harmed like outweighs like the violence within gangs, especially if you consider that there is a significant like amount of like get within gang violence due to the fact that violence is like the unifying force in these gangs and it's the way they operate. And so we should prioritize civilians, we should prioritize saving the most people, and we should be realistic about how these prisons look, which is why we believe side government should win this debate. Thank you.
Good round,
Great
guys.
round,
guys.
everyone.
Great round, guys.